Okay. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Welcome you once again for the our UOH History Webinar Series 19. Today we have very renowned personality, Professor Christopher Pinney from University College of London. Today he will be speaking us on contingency, futurity, and ethics, photographic ethnographies from Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. I'm sure, you'll enjoy the lecture. Of course, Professor Pinney doesn't need any introduction. He's a Padma Shri, and he's a very well-known anthropologist, and particularly, so his work in visual culture is very much applauded across the globe. So I request my colleague, Professor Dr. Varghese, to introduce Professor Pinney formally. Professor Pinney, as I told you, you can take about 50 minutes to 1 hour, and it will be followed by a comment by Dr. Sujit Parayal from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Okay, over to you, Varghese.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bangya. It's my delight to welcome and introduce Professor Christopher Pinney, the speaker of the day. Professor Christopher Pinney is a well-known anthropologist and art historian, and he's currently a professor of anthropology and visual culture in the Department of Anthropology at the University College London. And he's rightly someone who brought photographs into the study of Indian history and culture, someone who has actually inaugurated the photographic turn in the study of Indian history and culture. And Professor Pinney is working on a wide range of themes and issues, which includes the cosmology of industrialism and modernity, colonialism and photography, popular Indian visual culture, Indian studio photography, and of course, a more general field of visual anthropology as well. Not many perhaps today know that he started his research career with a completely different theme. He was working on the changing work regimes among the industrial workers in central India for his PhD, and the transformation entailing those changes in the work regimes. And he had his PhD in social anthropology from the London School of Economics in 1987. And it was his turn to photography and camera is largely a post to PhD development, I guess. And it was during his postdoctoral research as a SMUTS research fellow at the University of Cambridge. He began to work systematically on archival photography, investigating the role of image making within the early anthropological practice. And of course, he then conducted extensive field research in central India on popular visual culture, including photography and devotional imaginary. And this work was published subsequently as a book, and perhaps the well-known book of Professor Pinney, entitled Camera Indica, The Social Life of Indian Photographs, published in 1997 and from the Chicago University Press. And this work was particularly important in the sense that he was studying photographic practice in India as an embedded social practice since its inception. And alongside his village level field work, he was also he was deeply interested in the question of patterns of consumption as well. So, and apart from the village fieldwork, he was also working in the archives in the UK, India, and USA, researching particularly on the history of Hindu chromolithography. And this work was published later as a book entitled Photos of the Gods, the Printed Image and the Political Struggle in India, published in 2003 by the Reaction Books. And he conducted further research on the early aspects of photography, particularly looking at the history of early photography in India, which was again subsequently published as a book entitled The Coming of Photography in India in 2008. And this particular work he was doing for the Pinney lectures at the British Library in 2006. And it was published also subsequently by the British Library Publishing Division. And he was also deeply interested in the enterprise of anthropologists and its relationship with photography. And it was this relationship he was investigating in his other book called Photography and Anthropology, published in 2011, again by Reaction Books. And another area of interest that he held his hand on was the hands-on studio photography. Obviously at a time when physical materials combined with the photographer's artistry to shape the final image of the photograph. He was particularly looking at a studio in central India, namely Studio Suhag, in a small town called Nagda. And this work is again translated into a book entitled Artisan Camera, Studio Photography from Central India, published in 2013. Interestingly, he was also looking at the images of hell, and he was also looking at the pedagogic images of punishments in hell through a set of photographs available from 1880s to 2000. And this is a kind of visual history of punishment in Hindu hell, which was again published as a book entitled Lessons from Hell, Printing and Punishment in India, published in 2018. And currently he's engaged in a very, very interesting research project funded by European Research Council, which is about photography and political imagination and how camera and questions of citizenship are entangled. And apart from these books, of course, his work is published in various research journals, as well as chapters in many, many anthologies. And Professor Christopher Pinney has also taught and worked in many institutions, such as Australian National University, University of Chicago, University of Cape Town, and the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He has also got this distinction of having conferred with one of the highest civilian awards of India. It was in 2013, the government of India honored Professor Pinney by bestowing on him the Padma Shri for his contributions in the field of academics and literature. And today, the talk of the day comes from his ongoing work on photography and political imagination, particularly by looking at photographic ethnographies from South Asia, with special reference to the questions of contingency, futurity, and ethics. Very, very happy that Professor Christopher Pinney is here today with us talking on this topic. I am also happy to welcome Sujit Kumar Parai, who is a faculty at the Center for Media Studies in the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he's also interested, he's someone who is interested and working on the history of photography and visual culture with special reference to Kerala. And it was incidentally from Sujit, I came to know about Professor Pinney's work in the early 2000s when we were students in the University of Hyderabad. So Sujit will immediately after the presentation from Professor Pinney, as Professor Bangia said, Sujit will initiate the discussion. Thank you very much, and it's over to you, Professor Pinney.
Thank you, Bangia and Varghese, and looking forward very much to having Sujit as a respondent. Sujit, someone I've learned a great deal from over the years, and I think a lot of his ideas will probably be reflected in what I have to say. So what I wanted to do was provide a kind of overview of some of the preliminary ideas and thinking from an ethnographic project that I've been involved in the last few years, which is, let's just, so you can see the video okay, yeah?
Professor Pinney, speak a little louder.
Ah, okay, I'll turn my mic up full. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to give an overview of my contribution to a collective project called Citizens of Photography, the Camera and the Political Imagination, which, as you can see from the logo, is funded by the European Research Council. And it is a big comparative ethnographic investigation, which involves people working in Nicaragua, Nigeria, Greece, Sri Lanka, Cambodia. And my contribution as project leader is to conduct ethnographies of photographic use in Lucknow, in Nepal, and in Bangladesh. And I'm going to talk about that latter bit today. And I think a sort of key orientation here is to think of this as in many ways a vernacular, or maybe it'd be better to say demotic, attempt to investigate the problematic that's been theorized by Ariella Azoulay in the context of photojournalism. And the key idea here is that photography, rather than simply being about the solemnization and confirmation of what's already been achieved at the level of the social, has a prophetic and future-oriented, a subjunctive, or we might say proleptic dimension. So a key quote here from Azoulay's work, The Civil Contract of Photography, where she speaks about citizenship of photography available in advance of ordinary citizenship, points to her interest in the future potential of photography, how photography comes to make the world rather than merely confirm the world as it already is. So all the different ethnographic investigations as part of this project are really trying to investigate that hypothesis in relation to popular practice. And so one of the things I hope to persuade you of is that photography is in large part about imagining worlds that are yet to be. However, first of all, we have to confront the fact that most photographic practice, and particularly as one would encounter it in studio settings in South Asia, seems very much to be about the past. I hope to persuade you that that's not all there is to be said about this. So studios in particular often present themselves as spaces of nostalgia. This is SK Digital in Panoti at the far end of the Kathmandu Valley. And this is a very kind of typical encounter on first meeting or first introducing yourself as an anthropologist in the studio setting. The proprietor will then describe the history of the studio, probably will proudly display the first camera they used. We'll talk about the negatives they've in all probability still got stored in dusty wooden drawers. So the initial presentation is very much of a past history, but it makes more sense, I think, to see this as a historical presentation of a present that was once cutting edge. So these are modern technologies whose time has slightly passed. So this is from Studio 27 in downtown Dhaka, a vast studio which is still largely functioning and which still keeps all its old 120 negatives on the grounds that customers still now and again returned to the studio asking for prints from these ancient images. Here, as also here in Banaripara in rural southern Bangladesh, one's confronted with studio proprietors and workers' pride in the tools of their trade, their artisan skills. So this is Shahidul Islam of Shahid Art, showing me the various brushes he used to rework negatives to decrease shade and shadow, and brushes that were used also to overpaint photographic positives. So as a researcher, you're presented with what appears to be this vision of the past. But of course, that was a present and an anticipated future at one point, and now sedimented by history. This is from Mymensingh in northern Bangladesh. And it's very easy when looking at the archives of these establishments to fall into what I think of as a Bourdieuian trap, i.e. following the work of Pierre Bourdieu in his book, Photography and Middlebrow Art. One's tempted to see these images as what he calls solemnizations, confirmations of social practices, of socialities, of identities, collectivities, that are first of all established at the level of the social and then confirmed through visual imagery. And it strikes me that it makes usually more sense to see the space of the photographic studio as an invitation to assemble and perform identities that might not yet be perfected in the everyday social world. I find myself drawn to this image, which is again from that small town Panoti in the Kathmandu Valley, in a now abandoned studio. On what you can't see is on the adjacent wall, and there's an amazing backdrop of an airport scene. And what you're looking at here is the space on the wall where female studio subjects would wipe the lipstick off their fingers before they then went and posed for the camera. So it's very easy and tempting to see in these images a kind of memento mori of the past, a past remembrance. And it's that I'm suggesting that we need to be skeptical of. And so perhaps one of the ways one can bring this into some clearer definition is by thinking about the role of props in Nepali studios. This is again Banaripara in Bangladesh, where as is common in many studios throughout South Asia, ties and suits are kept for ID photography, for purposes such as bank loan applications. But one also finds them in studios throughout Nepal. This is New Golden Digital on the left in Bhaktapur in the middle of the Kathmandu Valley. And what you can also see are two Dhaka topis. So this sort of Nepali ikat style that was originally made in Dhaka in Bangladesh, hence the name. And the wearing of which up until about 2006 was compulsory for the making of the photograph that would go on your Nepali citizenship card. And I want to read a remarkable account by a journalist called Amendra Pokharel, this dates from 1986, who describes as a youngster going into a studio and putting on a dusty, rather disagreeable Dhaka topi like the one we can see on the left. And I'm just going to read you this paragraph long account, which I think reveals a huge amount. Holding out a shabby Dhaka topi, the photographer asked the boy, i.e. Pokharel, to put it on. He took the topi and peered inside only to find it dirty and frayed. Since the boy had reached the qualifying age for Nepalese citizenship, he was in the studio to have his photo taken for the card. For that, it was required for him to wear a Dhaka topi. He would have to wear it and bear it for a few seconds only, the boy thought, and never again, so the topi's condition didn't matter. He shook the topi in the air twice, patted it against his palms to shake out the dust, and then put it on. What he saw in the mirror stunned him. Suddenly the topi mattered, even a dirty, shabby and frayed one. His Nepali identity, buried in the recess of his subconscious mind, hit his consciousness in a flash. It reminded him who he was. His dispensation towards the piece of cloth now was completely different from the slipshod manner he handled it with in the beginning. He arranged the topi with a slight tilt on the left, covering half of the forehead on one side, and made a dent of a desirable shape at the top, the way he had seen kings, political figures, actors and commoners wearing it on television. After the photo, he took it off and placed it on the stand, folding it carefully, an act that spoke of the new meaning that he had just acquired from the topi. So what I think one has there so beautifully rendered is an account of transformation in the photographic studio. So Pokharel is not arriving at the studio with a ready formed identity, which is simply reconfirmed by the act of photography. He arrives unformed, undecided, skeptical, and in the space of the photo studio, this theatrical performance takes place, a transformation occurs, something new is introduced, something happens in that space that hasn't happened before. So this might be one of the ways in which one could understand what it is that Azoulay is trying to get at in the civil contract of photography, that, as she puts it later, photography deploys tactics with unpredictable ends. So I think it's important to grasp how this approach to photography differs not only from the Bourdieuian one. So Bourdieu also famously says, apropos of 1960s French popular photography, that family photograph albums have all the predictability and routinization of a faithfully visited family gravestone. So that's a fantastic image of the emptiness of photography for Bourdieu. It's like an empty gravestone that the family gathers around to solemnize what everyone already knows to be true. So there's that view of photography in Bourdieu. There's a parallel view in the way that photographic theorists have appropriated Foucault. So in the work of someone like John Tagg, for instance, there's very little surprising that ever happens in photography. There's very little new that ever happens. And that's because the photograph is simply a space for ideological inscription. It's a space for the importation of ideological conclusions that have already been formed and finished in other domains. The photograph is, so on the one hand, is an empty gravestone. In the Tagg Foucault version, it's a paltry piece of paper where nothing really happens except the servicing of the interests of the state. And I think the importance of Azoulay is she provides a way of rethinking that, albeit a utopian and in certain respects problematic one, but it certainly feels like a kind of liberation to read Azoulay and feel that one can, through her, rediscover the power and unpredictability of photography. This is an image, Pulitzer Prize winning image by the Dhaka photographer and activist Taslima Akhtar, titled The Final Embrace of a couple found in the remains of the Rana Plaza disaster in Dhaka in 2013. That was the collapse of a textile factory in which more than 1,000 people, workers, died in an act of corporate murder. And I wanted to use that to introduce a discussion I had in Dhaka which also illuminates another, I think, important aspect of Azule's work, and one that's probably of particular relevance to historians. So Taslima Akhtar and fellow activists organized in collaboration with relatives of the victims of Rana Plaza a series of commemorations, and on the fifth anniversary of the disaster, there was a public exhibition of a commemorative quilt, or a series of quilts rather, which incorporated cloth printed photographs of victims, which had been sewn into these quilts by surviving relatives of the victims. And there was a big public event at the Patshala Drik Gallery, which we can see here. And subsequently, I was discussing with one of the activists which of these very powerful images they found the most powerful, the most remarkable. And they pointed to this image, which was a group portrait of 8 friends who all worked in the factory together, which had been taken on Bangladesh National Day. And so they're all wearing clothes that echo the colours of the Bangladeshi flag. So it's a very joyous, happy photograph at the time of its making. But for the activists with whom I subsequently discussed it, it assumed a new power because 7 of the 8 people in this photograph had died in the building collapse. And the activists found this particularly poignant, this image, because it indicated that it indicated the precarity of the existence of the victims, because the family of the victim, or one of the victims at least, had only been able to use this image on a missing poster posted up at local hospitals in the vicinity of Rana Plaza. So the activist conclusion was that the family only had this one image of their daughter. They own no individual images of their daughter. And for the activists, the poignancy and the kind of pain of the image derived from the understanding that the victim had been unable to own their own representation fully. Now, I find this in the light of Azule very interesting in that it points to something that I think she very astutely diagnoses, which is an expectation about photography, or what we might call photographability. So that her point is that photography is not simply about the images that cameras produce, but it's about an expectation that certain forms of existence and of historical events should be, in theory, photographable. This maybe in the discussion we could think about the consequences of this in relation to Paul Valeri's 1939 lecture on photography, evidence and history, where he outlines a rather similar position that photography establishes that certain things, that is a class of events, in order to count as historical, should in theory be possible to photograph. But what I want to point to here is that photography then is more than camera and photographic prints. It's also an idea about visibility. It's also an idea about evidence. And here that idea also becomes an idea about entitlement to one's own self-representation, the denial of which this image was seen to embody. The other thing that I think Azule opens up is then the question of futurity, which is very much linked to contingency, and also the question of the political ethics of photography. But while working on this project, I came across a wonderful quote from Siegfried Kracauer, 1930s broadly Marxist German critic, associate of Benjamin and Adorno, who wrote a book on Offenbach in Paris in the early 19th century. And he writes about Delacroix's famous Liberty Leads the People, the painting we just saw. And he notes that when it was shown in the Salon of 1831, there was a continual crowd of interested viewers who milled around at the vicinity of it. And he has this to say about it. He concludes that the attraction of the painting Liberty Leads the People was not that it was just a graphic representation of the 3 glorious days of the July 1830 revolution, but also that it lifted a corner of the veil that hid the future. So I found that a very resonant phrase for thinking about photography's futurity. And I want to explore in some of the later parts of this conversation the ways in which maybe we can see photography lifting the veil that hides the future. I was also encouraged to have Delacroix in my mind after meeting Min Ratna Bajracharya in Kathmandu, a very wonderful Nepali photojournalist who's famous, among other things, for an image from 1990, known throughout Nepal as Dawn of Freedom, which shows a woman protester, Durga Thapa, sitting on someone's shoulders in a crowd. This is at in the kind of opening days of democratic adjustment in Nepal. And she's seated on someone's shoulders with her arms in the air, covered in celebratory red dye. And he describes how this famous image came to served as a template for future action in ways that he would come to find extremely frustrating, because at subsequent demonstrations, whenever he turned up, the crowd would recognize him, and various people would then try and perform this same pose as a sort of homage to the photographer who created it. But so this would serve as a good example of an image serving as a template for future action rather than simply as a document recording the past. However, of course, one has to concede that there are classes of images that of popular images that one encounters that are what Bourdieu would call sociograms, that are commemorative monuments, reactive, backward-looking ossifications in the face of chaos and precarity. This is a phone-generated montage from someone living in Bhaktapur over the history of migrant labor in Qatar, and whose shop and home were demolished in the 2015 earthquake in Kathmandu Valley. And what he's composed on his phone is a kind of utopic triangulation of his family with places of religious importance and divine power. And so his wife and daughter are there. There are 3 significant Bhaktapur temples, and then there are various manifestations and residences of the gods. In a similar fashion, this image from Borishal in southern Bangladesh is a kind of amazing monument to Bangladeshi patriarchy, and is well, almost like a display of a mala or a shop display of precious jewelry, but one which asserts unquestionably the preeminence of the elder male, the father, then the wife, then the male principle of succession, the young son, and then the 2 elder daughters. So there's a kind of quasi-linguistic statement being made in this arrangement, this assemblage of images. So I wanted to include these to concede that, of course, Bourdieu and others, sometimes are right in their descriptions, that some of these, sometimes photography does have the function of a faithfully visited gravestone. And one would probably want to say the same about images in Bangladesh, for instance, that comment on, record, or are used as memorials or monuments to the Liberation War of 1971. I have to say I encountered very few of them, but these are treated almost as sacred relics. And there is a genre of studio portraiture that involves photoshopping backdrops of monuments relating to the war. So the National Monument at Salvar on the left and the Language Martyrs Memorial on the right. So I want to concede that there are the picture is not simple and one-dimensional. There are nuances to it. But in general, I find that, I find the ethnography is more usefully opened up by Azoulay's perspective rather than Bourdieu or Tag's perspective. So this idea particularly is expressed here by Azoulay, that photography departs from the disciplinarian gaze, the pattern of communicating pre-recognized messages. It approximates at least the central distinguishing features of action. It includes the aspect of a new beginning, and its ends are unpredictable. So I found that to be very stimulating and useful hypothesis, and there's much in the empirical data that I've been able to gather over the last few years, which would support this. So one example of this would be a very striking movement in contemporary Nepal of what one might call Neo-Indigenization, which is one of the paradoxical consequences of period of Maoist rule, which has encouraged putatively autonomous indigenous identifications and sovereignties. And photo studios are often in the vanguard of this. So it's very common to see in, extremely common to see in photo studios in Kathmandu Valley, images promoting neo-noir identities through costume and jewelry, as here on the right. And most studios have a illustrative set of images that usually deploy this English term, cultural dress. So whereas throughout much of North India, photo studios would be busy photographing young children as Krishna in mini Krishna costumes. In much of the Kathmandu Valley, they're photographing especially young girls in Newar outfits, so-called cultural dress. And it's exactly the same impetus that one can see here in the back cover of a photo book, retailed by the oldest surviving studio in Kathmandu, Photo Concern, which was founded in 1960. And here you see, it's worthy of a 19th century anthropological essentialization of ethnic types, which is now the cutting edge, the past returned as an imminent future of atomizing indigenization. So pursuing this theme of unpredictable ends, it strikes me that when you wander into a studio, for instance, this is film, movie and stills in Newmarket in Dhaka. What one's likely to find there is not Bourdieuian solemnization, not Bourdieuian confirmation of what already exists, but photographs which are beginning journeys with unpredictable ends, photographs as envoys, as voyagers, travelers, migrants, plenipotentiaries. So on the wall on the left here of this studio, there's a display of prospective bride and groom marriage photographs, which of course still remain, along with marriage photography, one of the bedrocks of studio economic viability. So these are images that are being sent out on journeys, hoping to ensnare and trap a spouse. And these are images for which Azoulay's stress on futurity and unpredictability make much more sense than Bourdieu or Tag's stress on images as simply confirming what has already happened. The same could be said about much ID photography, especially as it relates to visa applications in high migration areas. And Varghese might be able to add to the conversation later from a Kerelan perspective in relation to migrant aspiration. So in Nepal and Bangladesh, the electronic diversity visa is a big part of the landscape every few months. And during the period that the lottery is open, photo studios essentially transform themselves into larger sprawling data processing units. So the core of this is the photo that the photographer will generate as part of the application, but then they also hire in people with word processing skills who essentially fill the form in for you on the spot, take your fee and submit the application. And one thing I'd like to stress here is that, you know, this is a space of hope, of aspiration. So there is that Taggian Foucauldian narrative of the mugshot photo, which sees it as simply oppressive, as a tool of the state, as a tool of control, as a kind of absolutely central artifact in the articulation of visibility and power, as a way of enforcing singular identities. This is from the village near Nagda, where I periodically work in central India. And I included because you can see how it's been countersigned by the chief medical officer. So there's a kind of photographic identity that has to be verified by a state identity. So of course there are images that conform to that Taggian vision. But much of my experience over the last few years is of encountering people clutching ID photographs with a sense of optimism. And in Bangladesh and Nepal, that's largely because these are going on visa applications and people are looking to the future, and the photographic image is part of that potential passport to the future. So the whole question of aspiration is also evident in a whole set of extraordinary images that, well, that make one think one needs a psychoanalytic methodology to fully unpack them. They also make me think of Krakauer's writing about photography, where he says that photography is the space in which we daydream, we dream about the future, we fantasize impossible alignments and juxtapositions. So this is an image made by a studio proprietor in Panoti in Kathmandu Valley of his daughter, and clearly is about a whimsically expressed political aspiration. This is from Birganj in southern Nepal, and might be a fine example of photography's subjunctive or proleptic possibility. So one couldn't have a more elaborate, amazing declaration of one's desire and aspiration to travel to the Gulf, to to become prosperous, to become mobile, connected. So photography, especially in incarnations such as this, allows for tacit identifications, latent aspirations to be fully vocalized, fully visualized, and made fully manifest. And here the work of Karen Strassler in Indonesia in a book called Refracted Visions has been very inspiring to me. And I was also recently in touch with Mohamed Shafiq Karin Kuriel, who's written very interestingly on aspirational photography in relation to Kerala migrants. So I'm also indebted to his work as well. And that previous Emirates image from Birganj might be the perfect illustration of his argument. So there are, I should say, I encountered many other spaces, locations, practices that bore out this Azulian stress on futurity and unpredictability. And this was especially clear at a place called Jaflong in northern Bangladesh, just by the border with India. You can see the river Pian in the background, and then that's India on the other side of the river. And this is a place that attracts domestic Bangladeshi tourists in large numbers, in part because there are rocks and boulders, which you don't get anywhere else in Bangladesh. So there's a novelty of encountering solid geological formations. But it's also a space of transculturation, a space of the non-national or the extra-national. So people come here to perform and to be photographed performing this act of dislocation or of aspirant transculturation or transnationalization even. And there are about 30 photographers working here. So some such as Aryan here, interlocutors Instagram page of recording his visit. You can see the river and India in the background on one of those images on the right. But about 30 commercial photographers are present, make a living at this location, photographing domestic tourists sitting on rocks in this kind of liminal zone between nations, pointing to a beyond or pointing to an ideal utopian non-national existence, non-bounded, non-territorialized existence. They're pointing to the freedom of the network, and often if there are Indian tourists sitting on rocks on the other side, these two groups will exchange WhatsApp numbers with each other, shouting across the river. So much the same argument, I think, could be made about backdrops. So I've encountered, as you would expect, an extraordinary range of extravagant, baroque, amazing, fantastical backdrops. These are all sourced from essentially a wooden shed called Rixon Studio in Banaripara. So a very small, lowly capitalized studio with very basic equipment. He'd been gifted about 700 Photoshop backdrops by the studio that he did his printing with in Borishol. And these are the kind of backdrops that are being inserted into the rural life world of poor southern Bangladeshis. So one can see here the prospect that photography offers of opening up entirely new worlds, entirely new alignments, entirely new future possibilities. I should speed up a bit. So in the same vein, we could say that there's a whole repertoire of objects of modernity. Here, picking up a bit on Karen Strassler's work. So what at first sight one might think of as merely quaint images are also declarations of modernity and freedom, once properly decoded. This is from Nepal, this is from Lucknow, this is from Studio Suhag that Varghese mentioned in the introduction in Nagda, Madhya Pradesh. This is also Studio Suhag. This is Central Indian rural village photograph on the left, taken in a mela in the early 80s. And this is from Ravi Muni studio in Kathmandu on the right. So the objects, artifacts of modernity that are usually available as studio props are also contribute to the repertoire which people mobilize in their performances of being modern, of being connected. One of the important things to say about those phones in those earlier images is that they weren't connected to any phone network. They were, the people who performed with those phones in the studio were literally talking to the future. And one encounters memorable images of modernity and futurity. So circa 1961, from Photo Concern in Kathmandu, Nepali baby with a Gagarin cosmonaut doll. And very commonly in lots of studios throughout South Asia and across all different periods up to the present, it's very striking how photography itself as a technology often becomes one of the signs that's mobilized to assert one's contemporaneity and one's futurity. So here from, again, Nepal, Agfa photographic packaging is held as a prop to signify your nowness, your modernity. Airport backdrops in semi-rural Kathmandu Valley. And of course, aspiration also has bourgeois incarnation. So that same guy from Bhaktapur, whose home and shop was destroyed in the earthquake, also used his phone to generate aspirant montages of where he wanted eventually to live. This also puts me in mind of the commercial networks that sustain these imaginaries. So in Mumbai, near Chhatrapati Shivaji terminus, there is a small studio called Krish Digital Studio that sells elaborate TIFFs as backdrops, which he sells to Moffasil studios so that they can interpolate the heads of their own small town and village clients. And he also has the deities also similarly available for immediate habitation. So looking at these images put me in mind of, the familiar argument about the rise of Hindutva, and especially I think Geeta Kapoor's very productive observation that from Ravi Verma onwards through calendar art and other popular aspects of popular visual culture, the time of the gods increasingly became our time. So her argument is that three-dimensionality, the tactility of representation allowed the gods to step from an ethereal time into the tangible, lived time of humans. I think this is a very powerful idea. This was Republic Live at the time of the Ayodhya initiation. Ayodhya say live from Ayodhya, as though Ram himself were reporting for this television channel live from Ayodhya. There's plenty of evidence of that trajectory about, but I'm struck photographically by a parallel but politically very different trajectory, and one in which Dalits and other oppressed and marginalized groups are able to use photography to claim participation in this singular valorized space. So this is again from examples from central India, in a village where it's still the case that Dalits are largely prevented from entering village temples. But by means of photography, they can stage encounters, intimate encounters with deities, especially at pilgrimage places where these caste exclusions don't apply. So this is at Ram Devra in Rajasthan. But there are also other more subtle uses of photography to assert and normalize aspects of Dalit life worlds. So this is Ambaram, again from the central Indian village, en route to Ram Devra, this very important pilgrimage center for Dalits, especially for Ravidasis. And he's halting, as you can see, at the Tower of Victory in Chittorgarh. But the image on the right interests me a lot. This is one of the photographer's props, a live horse. But Ambaram, getting it to rear up, is appropriating not only a Rajput martial aesthetic, but is also confounding village rules that prevent Dalits riding horses in the village, especially during wedding processions. So one can see here photography mobilized as an act of assertion and resistance, as also here. So activities, this puts me in mind of Kancha Ilaya's meatarianism, the meatarianism that at village level is kept largely covert, can also be paraded photographically. Photography thus becomes a space of assertion for acts that otherwise would be marginalized and contentious. So that Azulian argument about futurity, I think we can also explore in relation to memorial photography, photographs of the ancestors. That image which we just saw of Hira, who had been killed by a train, which featured on the cover of my first book, Camera Indica. His image is still very much part of the life of this village, and is a material object, which we can see here, that is the trigger object for possession events, in which family and caste members, other Ravidasis, gather around two relatives who incarnate with the Pret of Hira. So of course his Pret is still unsettled as a result of his violent death. So his Pret incarnates in the body of two relatives who are then able to mediate the future. So the photograph has a direct physical link through the touching of the photograph during the early stages of the possession event into the prognostications and future-oriented advice that the possessed family members are able to offer other relatives and caste members. And this, in my experience, is very common, so that, and it suggests that we need to grasp memorial photography not simply as relics of the past, but as ongoing actors in a continually unfolding world. This also explains why at village level, frequently I'm asked to re-photograph images of deceased family members. This is so that it can be turned into much larger scale laminated memorial portraits that then become actors in unfolding family and caste dynamics. And there's a very remarkable exemplification of this in Nepal, in a festival called Gai Jatra, in which photographs of all family members who have died during the previous year are tied to these extravagant poles and paraded. They're linked together and paraded, many hundreds of them, through major towns in the Kathmandu Valley. This happens to be in Bhaktapur. But so these portraits are stored up for the year. And this festival essentially is about helping ensure their satisfactory settlement in the place across from the river Vetuni. So this symbolism is entirely about a journey. It's about the future destination of the souls of these deceased people embodied in their photographs here. Speeding up very rapidly towards my end, and I see I've rather running out of time, I should just point to the contingency aspect. So contingency is very central to Azule's argument and is very much a Benjaminian conception of contingency that attends the photographic event. So the assumption here is that the photographic event, because it requires the assemblage of camera person, subject, mise en scène, is a real event located in the world, is going to be subject to all kinds of ineradicable contingencies. And I've been very struck in the last few years working on this project how that is undoubtedly true, and it helps explain why in many pilgrimage and ritual contexts, photographic systems and practices have evolved that seem to be intended to confront and minimize this contingency. So pilgrimage images from Mathura, for instance, the famous Manorat genre from Nathdwara, which is still alive and well. This is an image taken in a studio in Nathdwara a couple of years ago, which shows this wooden janki, inside of which eventually Sri Nathji is photoshopped, and then the devotees get themselves photographed symmetrically either side of this. So it's a fantastic mixture of different technologies, but in its attempt to preserve symmetry and formality, to my mind, is first and foremost struggling with contingency and the possibility that contingency will derail the power of the photograph. And in Nepal, there's a very interesting pilgrimage site called Dakshin Kali, up in the hills above Kathmandu, where there are about 20 photo studios using Photoshop to produce strangely similar images. They use templates that they've imported from Manakanama, a longer established pilgrimage destination. And all these 20 photo studios essentially photograph people in the same way with the same accoutrement, and they Photoshop them against the same backdrop, so that the Dakshin Kali image is subject to almost no variation. And I think this is pointing us to some very important conjunction of the minimization of contingency and ritual potency. And I also encountered this in relation to royal photography. This is Mangal Mohan Shrestha, formerly the favored royal photographer in the Nepali court. This is one of his images, which perhaps exemplifies what Rabi Mroué, the Lebanese theatre director, calls the photography of the tripod regime: fixed, static, frontal, designed to minimize contingency. And I heard many great stories about contingency in Nepali context. Gopal Chitrakar took this photograph in the 90s, photograph that became known as the Three Faces of Congress, which seemed to turn into an icon, people's hunch that the three Congress leaders of the time were facing in different directions. And then the best story I heard was from our old friend Minratna Vajracharya, who described an image which unfortunately I've not been able to trace, but was printed in the Nepali edition of the journal Himal, And he'd been following King Gyanendra at his first appearance in Parliament after the Royal Massacre in 2001. And he was photographing the King's encounter with the then Prime Minister. And he was, as he says, going click, 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 click. And one of these clicks captured a moment in which the Prime Minister had put his hands down. He'd finished his namaskar, and the King had still got his hands folded high in the air. And it looked in this image as though this contingently arrived at accidental image. It looked as though the King was saluting the superior Prime Minister. So it became a sort of radical and subversive symbol of democracy, delivered contingently, mobilized politically, and resulted in Vajracharya getting threatening calls from the Royal Press Office, asking him whether he was trying to insult the royal family with these dangerous images. I'll wrap up by just pursuing one further aspect of Min Ratna Vajracharya's practice. So he did the photography for a book by Prakash Raj called The Dancing Democracy, The Power of the Third Eye. And in this book, he talks about photography as the power of the third eye in very secular terms. And it's really a notion that he uses to encourage mass communication students in Kathmandu to use their camera imaginatively in the cause of democracy and of in the cause of greater rights and freedom. But I've been very struck by how the power of the third eye is often to be found incarnated in an almost literal messianic form. We'll see one example of that to conclude in just a moment. But let me first briefly detour to an encounter I had earlier this year in January 2020 in rural central India, where I was shown images from 1977. So this might also be taken as an example of the virtues of long-term ethnographic fieldwork, because it took a long time, many decades, for my interlocutors to disclose these fascinating images to me. And the story here was that basically on Tejas Dasmi, a local village festival, there was a Mutki Ford, the building of this human pyramid to place a mutka, a clay pot at the top. And villagers who participated in this described how they were aware as they were making the Mutki Ford of a mysterious presence next to them. And this was described as something like a 15 to 20 foot high person. And there was one point at which the Mutki Ford collapsed, and then they could feel the presence of this person helping cushion the blow as their bodies fell on this hard stony ground. And everyone in the Mutki Ford was amazed that no one had been hurt. And anyway, you can see the successfully constructed Mutki Ford on the left. And a photographer from Nagda was in attendance. And a few days later, when these photographs of the event were developed, all was revealed. And in the image on the right, you can see what locally was interpreted as the Nag Maharaj, the King Cobra. This is a Jujar, the spirit of a warrior who's been beheaded with a single blow, whose benign presence explained everyone's experience in the Mutki Ford. So there are competing explanations for this. What I've given you is the messianic one. Photographers in the same town also explain how in hot weather the emulsion on the negative can bubble and rupture, and that this may have been what happened. But it serves as an example of the way in which photography remains hugely contentious as a source of democratic optimism or messianic, well, an alternative messianic optimism. If we had time, I'd talk about the Razakar in the moon. Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. So this was in Bangladesh in 2013. But let me conclude with the third eye of democracy and give you a literal messianic example from the same village in central India. So this is an image taken by Kishore Sharma, a local Brahmin, on his smartphone. He was walking down the main drag of the village in 2011. Villagers were installing the kalash on top of the newly built or newly renovated Shiv temple. And then suddenly he saw this beam of light being sent down from Shiv's third eye, which illuminated the whole of the kalash. And anyway, here you can see he took it to Suag studio in Nagda, who we encountered earlier, and had it captioned and laminated, Pram Pratishta Divas, 2 March 2011, etc. So it serves as photographic evidence of divine intervention. And there's quite a lot of that about. There's a kind of negative version of that in the WhatsApp circulation of cow slaughter imagery, which is rife in this part of central India. It's also making itself felt through the photographic documentation, we should say the improving photographic documentation of miraculous divine presences, such as this Panchmukhi Nag, which first appeared in a local newspaper, now to be found in village puja rooms, as here, now circulates in upgraded versions as people master Photoshop better and better. There's unquestionably a struggle occurring between the secular third eye of democracy, the Min Ratna Bajracharya version, and the messianic version, which we've just seen. And that's one way of concluding that Azule's optimism is misplaced, that there's nothing intrinsic about photographic contingency that enhances citizenship. So if we think about the images we've just seen, the question then is the camera making accessible a citizenship in advance of ordinary political citizenship, or is it denying political citizenship to certain members of society? Is it fast-tracking certain dangerous messianic political claims? And maybe I'll just end with this summative slide. So what I've tried to suggest in this rather unstructured presentation is that photographs point to the future as much to the past. They're performative, transformative, transgressive, and point to unknown destinations. That future is uncertain, however. So what Benjamin called homogeneous empty time is giving way to messianic time. So we've got a choice between the third eye of democracy or Shiv's eye. But on the other hand, as I hope also to have shown, photography has always has always been not quite secular. This is a wonderful phrase that Kajari Jain uses in her book, Gods in the Bazaar, to suggest that even images that were ostensibly not engaging the divine were never quite secular. So I think that especially in its performative, proleptic and engagement with futurity, in those aspects, photography has always been not quite secular. then I'll skip that penultimate one because we didn't have time to discuss that. But my final point would be that it makes sense to think about not photography versus photographies. So this was the old John Tagg approach, that there was no such thing as a singular photography. This was also partly an argument against what was seen as techno-determinism. So no single photography, there were multiple photographies that reflected the different discursive formations that molded and empowered them. But what I've tried to present is an account that privileges photography in the world as actual practice. So here I would stake a claim for the term photographing as a gerund, photographing as a verb, as something in action, continually unfolding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pinney, for the illuminating and wonderful lecture. I think straight away I'll request Dr. Sujit Paral to respond to the lecture. Sujit?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, Sujit.
Yeah.
How much time you?
I won't take too much. I will be very brief.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Pinney, for such a wonderful and informative as well as very critical understanding of photographic practices in largely what we say South Asia, Nepal, Bangladesh, and India. As towards his conclusion, concluding remarks, he was saying that the future of ours is not that much pessimistic. It is very pessimistic in terms of because whatever the John Tagg says, the democracy of the photography at one point of time, when the initial research on photography was happened, there is lots of optimism is surrounded by the photographic practices or the photography. And quite evidently recently, for example, Ashley's work on ontology of photography, that is also placing the entire photographic practices as something as a political thing, where it is nothing that particular kind of time or the temporality that make the sense of the photography, rather than Ashley says that it is the more or less the political, the ways in which how the onlookers or the spectator that make the meaning out of it is each encounter that produce the meaning of the photograph. Today, Professor Pinney was actually looking at his lecture started from the studio photography, and he was saying that the studio photography is not something as a one cannot understand the studio space as something as a very stagnant space, but it's a very performative space, or it is something we have to understand studio photography not in terms of what Perry Bourdieu was talking about, that the whatever is being taken as a photograph is not already being defined by the social world, or it is not something like a sociogram, or the sociogram, or the affirmative, a certain kind of people already know whatever they want to take the photograph, that is already being taken, or that is already being given by the studio photograph. Now, this is the way. So if you are going to look at photography as a, Bourdieu understanding about photography as a middle-born art, but he was saying that whatever you want to take in the photography studio or popular photography, most of the time defined by certain kind of social practices, right? So it is whatever is already being defined, determined by the society, that can only be visible in the photography. So it is in a more or less a kind of a discursive context. If you want to understand a photography, you have to understand the discursive context in which that photograph has been produced. So it is that context you have to study in more or less what Tagg was actually saying. So this is in another way, what you're seeing is already been defined or something already happened prior to that event. But Pinney was actually, Professor Pinney is today pointing out while looking at the Nepali photograph or Bangladeshi or the photograph from the India, he was saying the photographic space and its props or its object is not completely belonging within this particular contemporaneity of the time, where he invoking the notion of uncontemporaneity of what Krakow was pointing out. You cannot understand photography with a mere linguistic sign or a mere understanding about what indexically it means. You have to always understand or the ways in which certain kind of sense experience, how your experience, your embodied experience is actually helping you to understand that photograph. That may be sometimes very political. You need not to be, see the photograph as the ways in which how either photographer or the subject who has been taking the photograph, anticipated that photograph. Rather than the studio space should be understood as something as a potential political space or a space which actually anticipating certain kind of inspiration, imagination, or in other way, when you're bringing back the political ontology, it says that it can be something as a photographic citizenship. As a photograph can always produce certain kind of idea about how you are actually anticipating certain kind of idea or imaginary about the citizenship, or the idea about identity, or the idea about the desirable or imaginary about one's own self. So in that level, it is not a confined thing. Maybe it is not something related to what historian is always being favorited as the contemporary, the contemporary period that makes sense of the photograph. Or it is other way around, we say that photograph is something as an evidence for something, or it is a kind of a particular memory that connected to the particular time. Rather here, more or less what Pinney is, if I'll recall the other word, it is the materiality of the object. Or if I go back to his own term, it is a figural excess, the intensified feel or the intensified felt value between inside the photograph as well as what the felt value or the embodied felt value that being, you know, that being triggered by the spectator. So that makes the meaning of the photograph. So in that level, he was also saying that the backdrops is also an important kind of important kind of element in order to understand the studio photograph. From that particular point, he moved to the another angle of the photographic practices, especially which connected to the India, that is the minimization of the contingency. So I think that is something very novel kind of, the kind of a new, it opened up a new possibility to understand the, or new possibility to engage how to interpret photography, especially within the time of the contemporary. So what is a contemporary photograph? I mean, we are actually, in a way flooded with the kind of a different kinds of photography. Are these photographs really reflecting the contemporary? Or are these photographs are having some kind of power to reflect the darkness of the contemporaneity? So in both way, photograph here is actually concealing certain kind of elements. In other way, it actually by eliminating certain kind of elements, certain kind of signs, certain kind of backdrops from the photograph, or connecting with what he was saying, that the secular notions of the third eye to the messianic notion of the third eye. That means the photography today, in another way, connected to the all other kinds of popular hegemonic movement, and that conceal or that reduces the political angle of the photograph, or that reduce what you can say about the third eye, the third democratic potential possibilities of the photograph. The moment you are actually going to take a photograph, something connected to your, I mean, in the later part of his essay, I mean, presentation, he was talking about the ways in which how the contemporary practices of the photograph is in a way connected to the messianic politics. That means, there are certain things, there are certain practices that is being dominated today within the contemporary practices of the photography. And that progressively, in a way, avoid or elicit the other dominant practices of the photograph. So this is something, a kind of the larger, what I can understand, what I can give you a kind of a large structure of the presentation and such kind of things. So now within this large structure, I would like to place some questions for the discussion. One is maybe going back to the questions about the uncontemporaneity, notion of the uncontemporaneity, or how one should move away from the Bourdieu's notions about the solemnizing movement, solemnization of the photograph to the uncontemporaneous nature of the photograph. One way, even Bourdieu, when he was talking about the photographic practices, he's more or less looking back to the practices, different practices that constructed the photographic practices, or that actually came into the presence of the photographic surfaces. That may be social, cultural, moral, legitimized practices, or whatever it may be. So one way you can say that there is a structure within which that photograph has been taken. But when it is come to the uncontemporaneity, or questions about what can say about the messianic politics today, in each of these structure or the discursive context, there is a certain kind of hegemonic discourses that actually creating certain kind of forces on the content of the photography or the photographic practices. So whether it is a discursive context, or whether it is in a kind of solemnizing event legitimized by social practices or norms, or even it's a dominant structure or dominant ideology. For example, in your paper, you're talking about how Nepali's political photograph has been, or it is narrative, visual narratives actually creating certain kinds of new ideas about the photographic practices that is connected to the political ontology of the photography. But even then, the three photographic books you are referring there, you can say that it has that particular books have certain kind of intents to invoke certain kind of sentiments of the people, whether it's a revolutionary, whether it is what you can say reactionary, or it is something connected to the very personal kind of affective relations. So there is also particular intention of the photographer, or the subject, or the viewer, in order to how one should actually being able to see this photograph. So that is more or less similar to when it goes back to the idea about the messianic thing. There is also hegemonic discourses that actually, in a way, forcing us to see this photograph in a particular way. In other ways, you are invoking the notions of Bloch in saying that the formative speech as well as the everyday speech act, in which the everyday speech act is something like it includes everything, but the formative or standardized kind of authoritarian kind of act is something like that. It is excluded many elements from our speech act in a standardization way. So in other way, the viewing sense is also in a way standardizing, demanding. The hegemonic discourses are actually demanding us to see certain things in a particular way. So how this messianic thing is something very different from the Bourdieu's understanding about that particular social conditioning of the visibility. This is one question. Obviously, you may be saying that it is an uncontemporality that gives certain kind of futuristic aspect of the photography. In another way, it opening up, or it actually lifting the veil to see what is hiding there in the future. So, or what is hiding in the future. So that way, obviously, the uncontemporaneity will help us to understand. But this uncontemporaneity is also, my problem here is that how can one treat uncontemporaneity is something that beyond the hegemonic discourses or the Nehruvian rationality. You're also pointing out, the messianic messianic kind of politics is sometimes hegemonized by the hegemonies over the Nehruvian rationality. So this is one of my first question. And the other thing, maybe the second question, coming back to the later part of your presentation today, is something related to the power of the social media, power of the social media visibility, or power of the, what you can say about the contemporary visibilities. Because one way we can say that this towards the end of your presentation, there is a kind of ritualistic or messianic thing is actually coming up. But this photograph or the messianic period or the messianic politics is also connected to the violent images that is also circulated in order to create certain kinds of politics which is connected to the dominant ideological group, whether it is a Hindutva politics or something like that. And that is also being circulating today's social media or through the WhatsApp and such kind of things. But on the other hand, there is a parallel kind of imaginary which is not restricting to which is not minimizing the contingency of the photograph. Parallel to this, there is no altogether different kinds of photography. What other way we can say resistance photography. For example, when the pandemic period, there are lots of photographs of the farmers, farmers or not farmers, the migrant workers walking back home. Now the farmers struggle. There are lots of photographs that has been used in order to communicate different kinds of idea. That is something goes beyond this particular idea about the standardization of the visibility or minimizing the conjugalities. So how you would respond to these two questions?
Well, thank you, Sujit, for your characteristically thoughtful, rigorous thinking on the subject. I take the first one as being more or less tag for or against. Does the question here being, does Azoulay do away with tag, or do we still have to wrestle in some form with that tag Foucault formulation? It strikes me that the attraction of Azoulay is that although I would concede that there is something utopian and foundationalist about her early work. Of course, her more recent work is very different and much more Taggian, paradoxically. But the early work, it encourages productive thought, I think, precisely because of its utopianism. So that on first reading it, you have the sense that almost of a dam having been burst, that a settled Foucauldian, episteme has been fatally ruptured and is deflating in a joyously liberating way. But so I'm trying to account for one's enthusiasm for the utopian proclamations. And I think it's the enthusiasm is in large part because of the sense of sterility that very doctrinaire impositions of the Taggian Foucauldian formulation imposed. But once the deflation settles a bit, and the rate of expulsion of hot air from the Foucauldian Taggian barrage balloon subsides, I think that then one starts to think, well, of course, there is still a contextual, discursive, Taggian problem that remains to be solved. And, you know, in certain respects, I can see how one, in the end, might then end up reinventing a softer version of tag, you know, which would account precisely for all those questions of circulation, for overlapping ideological framings. What I'm trying to say is that I think strategically one first stages Azulay as an alternative to tag. Pragmatically working through the issues, you reach a stage where you come to accept that there's a lot in tag that remains useful, but nevertheless, one needs a much softer version of tag. And I think the reason for that is that, I mean, to take, you know, your hegemonic forces, I mean, clearly, culturally, one has to address systems of dominance. But I don't believe in hegemonic forces in that straightforward way. I think so I mean, my kind of worldview is much more barbaresque. It assumes that things that have to be endlessly translated and in the process get iterated and deformed, that things are partial, things are contradictory, things are frequently fragile. So when I hear terms like hegemonic forces, to me that has the feeling of a kind of blunderbuss that that doesn't have the subtlety that one needs to understand the fragmented, frail, contradictory cultural world that confronts us. So yeah, so Azulay, I think, is a necessary and fantastically welcome correction. She doesn't completely displace that original paradigm, but I think she helps us revision it as something much less constraining and something which in its theoretical ruins is actually much more accurately describes the ruins of the world that we're in. On the second sort of related question, I mean, I was thinking, so well, I think there's a lot more to say about how the performative space of either the photo studio or the space in front of the camera encourages subjunctive performance, which, because the camera then delivers a certificate of that performance, renders it proleptic. It is achieved because the photograph is a document of its achievement. So I think there's a kind of rather simple mechanism that is rather revolutionary in its consequences. But again, I don't see that as being simply the work of ideology. So I entirely accept your point that you know, that there will be many different and differently nuanced practices of photography. But when I think about Jaflong, you know, that spot by the river in northern Bangladesh, where you can go and pretend that you're almost not in Bangladesh. I mean, well, you could say that's in part, of course, reflecting ideological assumptions about nationhood, but it's also about a whole material world. It's about the fact that you've got these big boulders in the river. You've got a river, a flowing river whose fluidity establishes the metaphor of national fluidity. So there's also a material, and in this case, a landscape infrastructure, which I also think is essential for the possibility of a place like Jaflong. So, you know, on the one hand, you wouldn't have what's happening at Jaflong without all these complex ideological determinants, the soft version of hegemonic forces. But I also think they're not wholly a result of that. It's also prosaic things like the placement of the river, you know, the shifting tectonic plates of the landscape, the shape of the boulders, the fact that it's near a town where there was already an established photographic infrastructure. So it's a whole set of things coming together that I don't think can all be reduced to ideology. But anyway, thank you for your provocations. But
can I have one more?
Professor Pinney, can you just stop sharing your screen so that we can have?
Sure.
Yeah. I was about to say that. Sujit, you have one more question?
Yeah, very brief, very short question.
Okay.
It is something to connect with the photography and history. I mean, more or less, one problem when I was reading Professor Pinney's other work, which is published in Daniel Miller's work, Materiality, where he was extended this point of contemporaneity or the uncontemporaneous. So it is something like goes beyond the mere linguistics sign. I mean, the photographic sign signified. You know, you cannot understand the signifier. For example, what is as a mere replication of certain kind of social fact or a signifier or something like that. But most of the time, historians like visual historians, most of the time we will work according to that particular linguistic sign and what are the kind of evidences or what are the kind of syntax it connected to that. Like so the uncontemporaneity, but more or less is something goes away from this particular kind of historical predicaments in terms of like that, there is a space, there is a time in which there is a particular kind of object, and that object has its history connected to that particular context and such kind of things. But then coming to the point of the questions about uncontemporaneity and history, I mean, when you are researching history of the photography or the photographic materiality or something like that, how uncontemporaneity can be used as a significant conceptual trope, precisely because it goes beyond the temporality or the speciality of that object belongs.
Well, I mean, one way of thinking about the materially embedded uncontemporaneity of things is to say that helps explain why the world is so messy, because it's not all seamlessly chugging along in the same time. So I think the example that Krakow gives in the On History book is, you can either think of of history as being a single vast river, and if you were to cut a cross slice of it, that would be the space of the contemporary, because you'd frozen a moment and you would be able to then trace the interconnectedness of things in that particular slice. The alternative to that, he suggests, is what one thinks of rivulets, i.e. lots of small streams that have different widths, different velocities, different characteristics. And the question then would be, why would one want to impose the fiction of their connectedness under the sign of contemporaneity? So I think the importance of Krakow is that he shows how the contemporary is a weird romanticist fantasy. And it's very intimately linked to nationalism. And the idea that the nations basically all inhabit the same time. So using Krakow and that notion of the uncontemporaneity or the uncontemporaneous, I think allows one to start with the assumption of messiness, that things that don't all endure under the sign of hegemonic forces, but that one should expect fracture, incompleteness, overlap, time lags, all kinds of contradictions. And I think one can see that in popular photographic practice. So, you know, photographic practices, often from the same studios, can be simultaneously super modern, people posing against city backdrops or with consumer durables, but simultaneously incredibly archaic. You know, so if you look at the way in which physical backdrops have endured in studios, or if you look at the physical poses that sitters, you know, agree on with their photographers, they're pretty much unchanged over 150 years. You know, that's very striking. So they're simultaneously a space of the archaic and the hypermodern. So whatever that is, it's not a space of contemporaneity. The one has been fast-tracked, the other has been backtracked.
Okay, Professor Pinney. Now the lecture is open for discussion. I mean, so if anyone has a question, clarification, they can unmute themselves and ask question directly to Professor Pinney.
Sir, I have a question, sir.
Yeah, please.
Please.
Sir, I happened to read your two books while I was trying to write my PhD synopsis. Ever since it was there in my mind. So like in the colonial times, in the princely states, like they were like power, like the power of the king is something like it is questioned. So like they are king with power, but the representation there. So like I happen to come across many of the photographs where like they're going for hunting and they have killed either a tiger or an elephant, and they stand with their rifle in front of the animal which they have killed. And such photographs are printed in large size and they're often displayed. So like what did they mean to show, like the valor which they once showed in the battlefields, like that they get somehow, you know, replaced, and with this photo image where they have shown their valor by killing a beast, or in another way, like they have used like in front of the people where the real power is with the British Raj, but the princely state also want to have that in front of the people that they are still the lords. So like I wish to hear your interpretation as well, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's a very interesting question. Well, I think my starting point would be one would want to scrutinize the genre carefully and take note of its differences. So I think that it would be wrong to assume from the outset that they already constitute a single genre and that therefore one only needs one account of them.
Yes, sir.
So listening to you talk, I was thinking of the famous and amazing story by George Orwell about his time in the Imperial Police in Burma. And he wrote an essay in the early 30s called Shooting an Elephant, which I think is well known through James Scott's account of it.
Yes, sir.
But what he describes there is, you know, there was a mad rampaging elephant in this village, and villagers notified him that he needed, as the you know, colonial official with a gun, to do something about it.
Yes, sir.
And he then sets off to try and deal with this. But if one was to assume the narrative that is the kind of standard narrative for the shikar photos, you know, one would imagine the story would go something like this. You know, Orwell gets his gun, he strides out purposefully, he identifies the elephant, he shoots it, he solves the problem, end of story. But what he describes famously is this sense of dread, and his sense that he knows he's not going to be able to meet the expectations of these Burmese villagers who are terrified by this elephant. And and it then becomes a kind of test of his colonial authority. as to whether he can subdue this elephant or not. And what Orwell describes brilliantly well is this sense of impotence, of failure, but also the ways in which he becomes a kind of puppet for the Burmese villagers. They become the rulers, telling him what to do, which he can't successfully execute. And he becomes, in some sense, the colonized, taking orders from them and doomed to fail. So it's a brilliant inversion of that relationship. So I think, you know, in the same way as in response to one of Sujit's points, I suggested that my view of the world was basically, you know, Barbaresque, i.e. it owed a lot more to Homi Bhabha's work than, say, Edward Said's. I wouldn't initially be convinced by the standard explanation that Shikar photographs are simply about man's dominion over nature and also a kind of colonial metaphor for the suppression and extermination of colonial subjects. I mean, I think there are elements of that that certainly might be convincing, but I would want to carefully look at those body of photographs and assume that they probably had a complicated story to tell, and that many might have stories to tell that were in conflict with each other.
Yes.
Okay, anybody else? Anandita, you have something?
Well, I did have a question. Chris, you did say something about many factors coming in, and I noticed that your images are largely confined to studios. Now, I was actually also wondering about the placement of these images outside. I mean, where do they figure? Are they simply images within studios, or are they also slipped in different spaces, right? You know, how much does these locations spill over into other spaces, which would perhaps also then lead to different questions about aesthetics. I mean, there is also a very important, take on aesthetics. In your first work, you had talked about kitsch. I remember that very clearly. So how would you look at the studio space spilling out over other spaces? And if they do, how would you look at that?
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, the photographs, well, I ought to say that probably the pragmatic reason for the predominance of photographs in studio locations is that compared to my work in central India, the field work was brief. So it was, you know, 8 months in Nepal, 3 months in Bangladesh. So that the kind of center of gravity was with studios as public spaces and talking to studio rather than building up long-term intimate relations with interlocutors, consumers as interlocutors. But I think I'd focus on maybe 2 examples to explore your question. I mean, the first could be wedding photography. So I showed from a Dhaka studio prospective wedding photographs that are circulated to locate suitable brides and grooms, and so they have complicated lives as individual physical prints that circulate, often with sheets of biodata, but more commonly would circulate through WhatsApp and Instagram, you know, also with biodata. But those same images, assuming that they result in a successful match, will probably then also find a permanent home in a laminated wedding book. So, you know, which is it's the traditional wedding album that's now a very expensive state-of-the-art photo book, printed often with, you know, excessive lamination and highly durable, highly expensive, rather remarkable artifact. So those images would have at least 3 material incarnations. You know, circulating as individual prints passed from relative to relative, circulating on digital platforms, and then finally deposited in the home of the married couple in the form of the wedding album. So in a similar way, one could think about memorial portraits in central India. And what strikes me very forcefully there is how uninterested the owners of these images are in preserving the original archaic material qualities of the image. So images of ancestors are continually upgraded, and the earlier images on which the subsequent image is based are usually discarded. So there's no attempt to conserve the Ur image. So I've been trying to write about it and think about it as something akin to anti-patina. So the idea is that you don't want to keep your old image precisely because it's degrading, and you can get a better new reworked Photoshop, you know, better laminated one. So when you've got the new image, you throw away the old image, and that's the dynamic that's then reproduced. And so the journey there is from what at the beginning looks like a recognizable, probably silver gelatin image, and through half a dozen iterations, what you have is this highly plasticized, primary colored, Photoshop, sort of almost caricature of the ancestor. So there's also, you know, what from one point of view is also a tremendous loss of verisimilitude. So I think different kinds of images have, you know, they have different journeys that take them through different kinds of materializations.
Yeah, we are actually.
Thank you.
Anandita, yeah, we are actually running Saturday time, so I request participants to be brief in their question. Anybody else?
Do we have time? I don't know, because it's...
Yeah, it is already 8. I think we can take at least one, and then we can close.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Professor Pinney. I particularly liked the way in which you entered, the talk, particularly highlighting how uncertain a medium is photograph, which can be used either for democratic optimism as well as for messianic optimism. Since you have commented on the aspirational photographs from the migrant location, I fully agree with the fact that the photographs that comes from migration locations in the 1980s and 90s significantly hide the experience of labor, significantly hide the locations of labor, instead are filled with images of richness, spectacular, etc., which actually goes in line with the argument of Philip Osler, etc., actually makes some spectacular spending for social mobility, etc. But my comment is regarding another important dimension, because how these photographs basically also create certain amount of familial optimism. I remember in the migrant families in the 1980s, 90s, once you go to the Gulf, the person come back after 3-4 years or even 5 years or even more. So they actually take this family photograph whenever they are available and keep it, as a reaffirmation for the family, the so-called family. There is also a technique of manufacturing familial photograph, because a photograph taken in the Gulf of the migrant as well as the family back in Kerala, for instance, will be assembled and brought together by the photographers in the Gulf, and that will be sent back home, and which actually, obviously a kind of anticipation of the reunion, as well as perhaps, resolving the temporary, disconnect, geographical as well as physical. So I'm just wondering how these familial photographs, either manufactured or the other way round, work in terms of the power structure within the family, because usually we hear that such photographs is reaffirming, the entrenched power situations within the family. So I'm just wondering how it actually negotiates. Is there any examples that you have come across in which there is a negotiation also happening in the frames of photographs?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's a great future research topic. Unfortunately, I've not done any of that research, so I'm kind of tantalized by the question and unable to offer any answers. I mean, it was my experience in Nepal that usually when one's shown in domestic settings images of migrants who are not present in the household at the time, that there's a pretty depressing story of problems with contracts, alcoholism, but I mean it's a kind of dream gone wrong. So one's frequently struck by the disjuncture between the vision of composed opulence that the image is conveying and the tacit narrative that's actually being offered by the immediate relative. I mean, so it suggests that there's a kind of crunch point where the image is unable to do the work that it was intended for, or that the commissioner of the work hoped it would do. So the image then gets over-scripted by other kinds of knowledges, other kinds of experiences. So yeah, but on the other hand, I'm thinking that also in Nepal, the Qatar security guard, he'd generated a very large number of phone montages that sustained a heroic, successful narrative. But in that case, he was able to mediate the narrative directly to his wife and daughter. So he was in control of the photographs and he was in control of the narrative. So it was less likely to go off the rails. But I think what you're outlining is a great topic for a future research project. But it's a fascinating question, but one I can only very fleetingly comment on, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Professor Pinney. I think we'll close it here. I request my colleague, Dr. Vijay Ramdas, to propose a formal vote of thanks. Vijay, over to you.
Thank you, Bangya. Thank you, Professor Christopher. It's very enjoyable talk. I think everyone enjoyed your illuminating talk on photographic ethnographies from South Asia. It has different materialities and specialities. I used a similar kind of photograph in my article on Jim Corbett. So your study is very relevant to me as well, though I'm a historian, not an anthropologist. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining this, very illuminating talk from Professor Christopher Pinney. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Christopher.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Great to meet you.
Thank you so much, Penny and Sujit, for your comments and participating in the discussion. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Pinney. I shall write to you.
Yes, my pleasure. Hope to connect with you non-virtually in the not too distant future.
Sure, sure.
Yeah,
we should get you here to Hyderabad sometime. Yes.
Yeah, sure.
That would be great. Okay, thank you very
Okay,
much.
thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sujit.
Oh, thanks, Sujit. Yes.